If you want to improve your watercolor skills, one of the best things you can do is to paint a new subject, something completely different from your usual style with a different shape, texture, or even a color palette. Which is why I decided to include a butterfly instead of my typical bird in this composition, so together we can explore how to approach the layering process, figure out what makes this subject unique in terms of watercolor techniques, and work through some interesting challenges. By the end of this video, I hope you feel inspired to try something new and discover unexplored potential for fresh, creative work. The reference photo is in the video description below, and as always, you can enjoy the full painting step by step, including the poppy flowers, in real time on my Patreon channel with detailed commentary and a black and white outline. And I know that many of you follow my tutorials in real time, focusing on sort of one section at a time, because my compositions tend to be rather complex. So for convenience, I took this butterfly that I've painted with the poppies and I did a separate version so that you can paint it as a standalone or paint it on a completely different flower. Whatever you like, do whatever is most convenient for you. If you're ready, let's get started. So in the first layer, we will do a lot of kind of larger shapes and color mapping. Wet on wet, very light. This is a typical process for any of my tutorials, and just generally in watercolors, we're working from light to dark. So you will see me work in sections, focusing first on the yellow spots, then larger shapes on the wings that are facing us, then the tail and the body. I don't really have a preference for yellow. I think it would be nice if it was something light and transparent or semi-transparent. Later on, we may add a little bit of orange splash in the final step, but for now, just a light layer on each spot, and I decided to go with my Hansa Yellow Deep simply because I like that color. In order to save myself some time, I left those yellow spots to dry and switched to the back wing. We only have one section visible, and we want to do just one stripe. So start with a super light blue and then try to introduce a little bit of purple around it. Next step, let's create the background layer on this bottom wing. You can see that I'm painting around the yellow spots and also around the white spots. So this is why it is very helpful to have just a hint of color at this point so you don't accidentally go over some of the important parts. And don't worry about the veins, we will do them later on. So just paint over them, cover everything but the white and yellow spots, and get closer to that central section where we're gonna switch to purple. So you can see I'm gonna blend with clear water, cover the rest of the wing with clear water, and now I can go with my more saturated darker blue, and I'm using my favorite phthalo blue green shade. It's really vibrant. It's a little bit cooler than the blue in the reference photo, but I find it to be more suitable here because it's going to stand out a lot more. It's a lot more vibrant. You can see it's going to be spreading towards the base, but around the yellow spots and the white spots, we're going to have to make sure there's a hard edge. Here I go with my purple, and I've added tiny bit of Perylene Violet. You don't have to. I'm just making it a little bit more subtle and warm because that's what I see in the reference photo. I have the two colors very close on my palette. So it's kind of a mixture of Perylene Violet and purple, heavier on the purple side, just a hint of violet. Let's leave this section to dry and go back to the back of the wing that's visible up on top. And again, I'm using a mixture of my Dioxazine purple. I've added a tiny bit of indigo just to cool it off, because remember, things that are closer to blue on a color spectrum appear further away, so having a little bit of indigo blue here helps me kind of mute that contrast. When it's ready, you can drop a little bit more indigo around the bottom edge. For now, we're just mapping out the main color blocks, and let's also do this extended kind of wing or feather looking shape. Leave it to dry. Had a coffee just to allow my paper to dry completely, and let's work on the background layer and the remaining section of the wing. Cover everything, and again I'm using just a hint of purple in my water. And the reason I'm doing it is because we have a tiny white spot that I want to paint around on the left hand side and a few white spots on the edge. So I just want to see where I'm putting my water, so I've added a tiny bit of purple there. Now I'm gonna work with 3 colors, so starting with a mixture of Perlin violet and purple up on top and around the edge, and I'm gonna go pretty heavy on the violet just around the top edge so that I can differentiate this side of the wing from the one that we're seeing in the back. And then in the center, what you want to do is use something similar to that first initial mixture that we used on the back of the wing, that section that's barely visible. So indigo and Dioxazine purple. You can add a little bit of blue there. If you're using a simplified palette, just purple is good enough with a splash of blue at the bottom. You can try to create some lines wet on wet if you can, just along those veins that we see in the reference photo. They don't need to be precise, and that's it. Let's leave it to dry, and we can work on the body now. So again, the first layer is super light. We're just mapping out the areas of color, and I went with a mixture of blue and Dioxazine purple. Here I'm going to show you on my palette what that looks like. I just dropped a little bit of purple into my phthalo blue green shade, and you can quickly switch back and forth, dipping into the pure blue for the center of the body, just painting very carefully around the white spots. So I'm going to switch to my second well where I'm adding indigo into my purple, just to make it almost like gray, purplish gray color. And indigo always looks black or dark gray if you're not using black. So just in contrast with other bright colors, if you're not introducing pure black from the tube, indigo will serve as black. And you can see here it's drying out, looking quite dark, but we know that there's a little bit of that purple and violet in there just to add some visual interest and overall make it look less harsh. So you can see I'm adding more and more value now that I've outlined those white spots. And then kind of the front of the chest, it's barely visible, but it's going to be a lot lighter. The goal in this layer is to simply create the silhouette and paint around those white spots. So I'm working very, very slowly. I go around each spot and then I sort of fill it in. And of course I want the legs to be defined as well. So I'm painting around those shapes. And now I'm adding a little bit of blue as I'm painting those elongated elements and trying to also leave a few highlights. But again, don't worry about the white highlights. If it's too intricate, you can always follow up with white gouache. So just paint it as a solid shape if you want, and then we'll do white gouache in the end. What I'm gonna do here, because I'm painting this butterfly as a separate element, is I'm not going to paint the end of each limb, so I'm not going to go all the way down because I want to give you an opportunity to add a flower if you're doing a standalone piece, and then you would do the flower there and then follow up with the legs up on top. So just to explain to you why I'm not extending it all the way, just giving you that flexibility to add the flower element, and then we'll finish it off together. For the eye, I'm gonna do what I do on pretty much all my eyes, whether it's an animal or human. I'm going to start with phthalo blue green shade, paint around the highlight, and then at the bottom do a splash of red. Now that red is actually a reflection from the flower, so the eye is pretty smooth and glossy, gives a lot of reflection. So if you're painting a flower that's not red, then don't add a red highlight there. Let's talk about the next step in our process, which is the more intricate details and the first layer of shadows. So we're going to be working wet on dry in this layer, so a lot more kind of relaxing process. We don't need to rush. Our colors will be slightly more saturated, and we will do a lot of details, including the veins. but this is actually a lot easier. I find that the first layer where we were very careful with kind of mapping out our color, doing wet on wet, now we're just going to do wet on dry. All we're doing is painting around the yellow spots. Of course, you can use Payne's gray, you don't need indigo, even black if you want to go for more kind of stark contrast. But I'm going with indigo. It looks practically black, especially next to our lighter hues. And I'm using my smallest brush because we need to also do some of the veins. So go carefully around each yellow spot and then kind of carry it out. You can do a jagged edge or a more smooth shape. I prefer a little bit of irregularity just to mimic sort of the natural shapes there. It's actually scales, tiny scales that make up these different elements on butterfly's wing. So these are not kind of smooth shapes if you look up close. And I have a lot of books about butterflies with really high resolution photos where you can see those. It's really fascinating to see them up close. My mom used to collect real butterflies and still has a ton of different butterflies and actually other insects around her house, real ones framed. So I've spent a lot of time as a kid just sort of staring at these creatures up close and studying them, and I kind of have a renewed interest in this topic since I started working on this painting, so you might see more butterflies in my tutorials and my compositions in the future. All that is to say, here you don't need to worry about very precise shapes around those yellow spots. You can also just blend them out with blue. Do what works best for you. You can see in the larger composition where I painted this butterfly next to poppies, I've blended a lot of these spots, just making them disappear into the blue. Here I'm choosing kind of a more contrast look, but it's entirely up to you. As long as there is a lot of indigo or whatever your darker color is right next to that yellow spot, it's gonna look quite nice and very close to the reference photo. And let's not forget about this beautiful feather-like element extending out to the left. Once again, note that it's not a smooth shape. It has a lot of sort of flyaway feather-like elements, and so I did those with the tip of my brush, and now I'm going to continue down. Again, I'm outlining the shape, focusing on a clean edge around the yellow spot, and then you have two options. You can either blend it out with clear water or create kind of a jagged edge. And all we have to do now is paint the veins. So I made a deliberate choice for this tutorial and for this second kind of streamlined version to not use negative painting. I think it's working out a lot better than my first version. We don't need to worry about painting around the veins. We can just simply use our smallest brush and paint them using a dark mixture of a violet and purple, or just use purple if you're using a limited palette. If you want, in the last step, we'll add a few white highlights around these. So if by accident you made them too thick, or they look like they're maybe a little bit too thick, you'll see me kind of in a few spots going a little bit maybe too thick. We'll cover them with white highlights, so don't worry about that. It's gonna look quite nice in the end if you're using white gouache with me for the final step. And if you got it like correctly right away, thin, then perfect. That's amazing. I'm using brush size number 1, but of course you can go even smaller. This one is just like, it's really good. I don't need to go to 00. If you want to kind of get a more smooth line, go for a longer brush. It will give you more control and the line will look more straight. And small, subtle detail, but you can see what I'm going to do where those lines connect. I'm going to add a little bit of a kind of a triangular shape. so they don't look too unnatural in those spots. And now let's do the same thing up on top. Here I'm not as successful making a straight continuous line. I had to kind of turn my paper around because, I don't know, my hand is shaking. Maybe I had too much coffee. So if you don't have a brush that's longer, which will make it easier to do a long straight line, just do it in sections. And if it does come out too thick, don't worry, we'll add white highlights on it. There's always a way to fix something you may not like. And now what we have is a couple of veins that we're going to paint around. So you can skip towards the end of this section to see where I've landed, but essentially I just painted inside those areas in between the veins with the tip of my brush. I just sort of outline the shape and then fill it in. I'm starting lighter than I want it to be, and then I add color just to allow some flexibility in case I make a mistake and in case I need to lift the paint. So you can see I sort of go around that shape, and there's still a faint pencil outline that I'm using as a reference. Fill it in. This is negative painting. Again, we're painting around a lighter subject. We're just painting a shape that makes a lighter element stand out. So you can see the vein kind of pops. And then I'm adding darker indigo mixed with blue, or simply use indigo. At this point, I'm sort of just dipping into the darkest, coolest pigments I have. And that's it. Let's focus on the tail for the next couple of minutes. If you're enjoying this video so far, please hit the like button and do subscribe if you haven't done so already. This is the best way to support my channel, and I really appreciate all your comments and feedback on my videos. And also I'm always curious to know what you think works well and what things you would like to see me paint and watercolor topics you would like me to address in the future. Thank you all for your support. Let's get back to our butterfly. So grab like a darker mixture of maybe blue and purple, maybe indigo and blue, whatever feels right. I don't want to be too prescriptive here. I'm just using a mixture of indigo and purple. And what we're trying to do is create a nice sharp silhouette. So we're going to place the color around the edges of the tail shape and maybe extend it towards the center using the tip of your brush, and then blend with clear water using a larger brush. Once you move all the way to the bottom, let's do the same around the opposite side. If you feel like playing around, if you like my style, switch up your color temperature. If you were using more purple and blue up on top, here you can go with pure violet. I went with Perlin violet. As always, it is not essential to have variations in color. The main thing here is the differences in values, lights and darks. Let's focus on the body. And again, this is second layer, so we're using slightly more saturated color, only focusing on the larger shadows. Let's grab our darkest color. So let's say I'm working with indigo, maybe you're using Payne's gray, and let's work around those white spots. I'm working towards this look you can see in the process shot. So I'm working around the white spots and extending my color up into the wing, that small section at the base of the wing, and moving all the way towards the eye. Working very carefully around the eye. That's where it's important that the first layer is dry completely. And if you want, if your brush allows for this, you can do tiny kind of hair like strokes. So again, if you look at the butterfly up close, it's more like a bird. It has these tiny little feather-like elements, so you can add those around the body. So they're not present as much on the tail, but definitely around the eyes and the chest. And if you're getting lost in these details, then just do one solid shape on the side around the white spots and maybe just outline the legs. But if you want to really zoom in, and if you're enjoying this kind of intricate brushwork, then follow along. I'm getting really into the small details here, painting around the highlights, and I know that this may or may not be everyone's cup of tea. I simply enjoy it. It's the part of the process that's kind of soothing for me, but it's not necessary at all. I'm just showing you sort of the parts that I find the most interesting. It's like a challenge. I want to get them right with the tip of my brush. At this point, I'm also going to do kind of the tip of his or her head, and you can simply do a one big round stroke around just to kind of complete that shape. And I'm going to add a tiny bit of phthalo blue around the highlight because I feel like it dried out looking too light. And that's it for the second layer. This third layer will be all about large shadows, which are only present on this butterfly because the picture was taken on a sunny day. There's a lot of contrast, and so there's some very intricate shadows on the wings. I really did a poor job, I think, in the first version, so here I feel a lot more confident, and I'm going to show you how I've approached it. And I recommend, if you're following along with me, do create a pencil outline. There are a couple of main shapes, so I'm going to focus on the first one, add some very light blue mixture, and then add a little bit of more saturated blue mixed with the Dioxazine purple closer to the base, and then a little bit of violet closer to the edge. And that's sort of the logic of all these shadows that are coming up. More of a violet towards the edge, more blue towards the base. The shadows are quite intricate. The surface of the wing, if you look up close, it's not straight, it's not smooth. There's a lot of sort of a wavy kind of patterns, and they don't necessarily overlap with the veins. So that's what makes it complicated. You're painting shadows, creating these new shapes on top of the slices that are naturally kind of outlined by the veins. But of course, I find this kind of an interesting challenge, and so what I'm doing is painting these shadows one by one. I started from the one that's sort of closer to the bottom wing. Then I'm doing this little slice, trying to put some color down and then blend with clear water, not touching the first shadow that I've painted. And now I'm gonna do a huge shadow up on top. Here's what my mixture looks like. Blue and purple, very light, and I'm just following my pencil marks, so I'm not guessing here. This is, for me, this would be too stressful to try to guess the shape. You can use simply a light layer of purple, again, if you're using a limited palette. I kind of see a lot of blue there, almost going all the way to black in the reference photo. So we're gonna make it darker. I just want to get the shape right. And now let's make it dark. So I'm gonna use that same initial mixture but add some indigo into it and go more heavy on the blue. So now it's more saturated, but I'm working with the shape that I'm happy with. So however it spreads now, let's just let it do its magic wet on wet. Okay, so that was a bit of an intricate section. I was holding my breath a lot. The bottom wing, much more simple. So one thing we want to do, one thing that will help you add some more realism and visual interest, is capturing those little grooves on the wing that create shadows. And so those shadows are present and especially obvious on the yellow spots. Look closely at the reference photo. It's like the wing is kind of wavy or bent. And so in the shadow areas on the yellow spots, we have more intense yellow or orange. Pick any transparent orange or warm yellow you have on hand. The one that I'm using is transparent pyrrole orange, only because I've used it on the poppies in a larger composition with this butterfly. So just for continuity, same pigment. I love recycling my colors. Always makes the composition look more cohesive. Similarly, for the white spots, just add a hint of blue or blue mixed with indigo if you want, but really, really lightly. Just following that natural, elongated kind of shadow that extends from the edge and all the way across. So those blue shadows, they will meet your orange shadows, technically, if you extend them. The last thing I want to do is use my Dioxazine purple to add some shadows at the base on that purple layer. And what I'm going to do is just do a very light kind of outline, leaving the center of each section without any color, and then I'm going to blend with clear water. And now, as promised, we'll introduce a little bit of white gouache. So if you were painting with larger brushes or simplifying your shapes, and maybe you've covered some of those small white dots, now is the chance to add them using white gouache. In addition, there's some highlights that you may want to accentuate. So for about 6-7 minutes or so, I'm gonna work with my smallest brush and a pretty thick mixture of water and white gouache, and I'm gonna paint the highlights that I see in the reference photo, focusing on the main veins. So they're gonna kind of stand out as you do that. I will double down on them several times. So the thing about using white on top of watercolor is that it plays tricks on you. It becomes darker and darker as the water evaporates. So you may need to do several lines. This is also an opportunity to fix some of the veins if the ones that you've painted were too thick or maybe too jagged, so you can kind of shape them by painting around them. Here on the back of this wing, remember I said if you were just to skip the negative painting and paint one solid shape, that's your opportunity to add the veins. And you can also do some highlights on the legs if you didn't do it in the first layer, or maybe they're not visible enough. So just play around with it. Don't overdo it, but a few lines and dots here and there looks quite nice at this stage. Just make sure your first layer is completely dry. And that's about it for this gouache layer. Our last step is just to do an antenna and the feet, or I'm sure they have a correct name. Scientists may be able to help me identify the name, but I'm just going to call it feet. And we're going to paint it using indigo and purple on top of whatever flower or a splash of color that you may want to place your butterfly on. I will be the first one to admit that the nose, or that particular element that, again, I don't know the correct term for, the one that the butterfly is using to drink, maybe it's a tongue, I don't know, it kind of curls up when the butterfly is not using it, and it's extended in this version. I made it too thick in the larger composition. I tried to save it using gouache highlight, not my best work, and I hope you're able to make it a little bit thinner, but in this standalone version I did a better job. I hope you enjoyed this video, and for those of you interested in the poppy tutorial, I posted it last week on my YouTube channel, and once again you can find the entire composition in real time on my Patreon. Thank you to everyone who supports me on Patreon and here on YouTube. Have a wonderful week ahead. Thank you for watching and painting with me.